Hi, and welcome to a presentation, The Cultural Phenomenon of Home DNA Testing, to be presented by Libby Copeland. I'm James Hampton here at your Medgar Library, and we're really excited to be talking to Ms. Copeland today. Libby Copeland has written a book. It's called The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are. And she'll be with us in just a moment via Zoom, and we can talk to her and ask her a few questions, and she can let us know what's going on with the cultural phenomenon of home DNA testing. So Libby Copeland is here with us, and she's written a new book, The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are. And she's an award-winning journalist. She wrote for the New York, for the Washington Post, and she's done her research. She's a science journalist, and we're just really excited to have her here. And if you would tell us a little bit about yourself, and we could get into what we want to learn about DNA testing and how it's changing the culture.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, James. Thank you for having me. So I've been a journalist for about 22 years and spent half my career at the Washington Post and the most recent half as a freelancer. So I write for outlets like the New York Times, and I still write for the Post and Smithsonian, the Atlantic. Often stories that have to do with science and the intersection of the way we see the world and our culture and technology, how technology is changing our culture. So about 4 years ago, I was in conversation with my editor at the Washington Post, and we were interested in how DNA testing, which has become this big industry, and 4 years ago was not quite as big as it is now, but was starting to really demonstrate how big it was. How that was sometimes getting people in touch with the past in ways that was altering their understanding of history and how they had, for instance, come to this country. And then sometimes also offering them surprises about the present, right? About their own families, the construction of their families, sometimes surprising them in really profound ways, like, revealing, for instance, that the man you think of as dad is not genetically your father, right? And prompting
Right.
some really difficult conversation. So sometimes surprises about our own origins, our families, and our roots. And I thought that was such a kind of a profound moment that we found ourselves in, that particularly when people go into it with like low expectations or no expectations, that this is just kind of a form of entertainment, that they're getting these kind of really big surprises, and then they're wrestling with them for years and perhaps for the rest of their lives. I thought I wanted to write about that. So I wrote a story for the Washington Post about the phenomenon of unexpected DNA results. And I got this flood of reader email from people who were saying, like, I loved that story, but now, like, I got to tell you my story because it's really good.
Okay.
And they were people who were like, I took a DNA test 3 years ago, or I took a DNA test 3 months ago, and here's how it's changed how I see the world and changed my relationships with my family members and changed how I view myself. Really major discoveries that people were making. That was when I started thinking, there's a lot here. This is like a big cultural change for Americans. Maybe this needs to be a book.
Right. And I heard about this new term when I learned about this interview. It was going to be it's non-paternity events, NPEs, not parent expected. Could you talk about that a little bit? What are those, and how do they impact people?
Yeah, so an NPE, like you said, stands for non-paternity event, is the old definition, which comes to us by way of genealogy. Or sometimes now it's translated as not parent expected, or sometimes it's called a misattributed parentage experience. There's all these kind of euphemisms for the process of, discovering, often by DNA test, that one or both of your parents isn't genetically related to you, typically your dad. And so that is a phenomenon that, we just know statistically is going to hit a certain number of people, right? It's not limited to any particular group or country or age group, right? It's just like this happens. But in the past, before DNA testing, it wasn't uncovered the way that it is now, right? Sort of by accident, because you do something on a whim that you think of as, a maybe testing to see how Italian or Nigerian you are, and then discovering this kind of unexpected detour where half of the relatives that you're finding in your list of DNA matches are unfamiliar to you, and gradually piecing together that, oh my gosh, the man that I consider dad, who I adore, is not my biological father. Like, what do you do with that? That's probably one of the most common, it's certainly one of the most, if not the most common kind of DNA surprise that that people are getting right now. And I should back up and say, when you do a DNA test through one of the big companies like Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, or Family Tree DNA, those are the big four, most people are not getting a big surprise, right? They're getting understanding of the roots perhaps, but it's usually in line with what they thought. It might help them do genealogical research. Then there is this significant minority of people who are getting a surprise. So there's about 37 million DNA test kits that have been sold at this time. And of those, certainly at least 1 million of people who've taken a test have discovered that either they are the product of a non-paternity event or not parent expected, or they have a previously unknown genetic half-sibling, according to the research that I've done. And that is a very conservative estimate. The true numbers are much higher, in part because there are many other categories of surprise, but also because you don't have to be the one who's tested to be affected by a revelation, right? Imagine you're the dad now in that situation, or the woman who's married to the dad, the mom, right, who's now having some painful conversations, or potentially the other family, right? And so there's this whole kind of ripple effect when a single consumer takes a DNA test that impacts often people who have never even gone near this technology.
Yeah, I've heard about parents finding out, or the child finding out, I have a different parent, even before genetic testing was popular. It's more somebody's been holding on to a secret, and so you can figure it out and find out. And a lot of times people have a sense even beforehand that something's a little bit different. What's going on with this guy? And so it just seems like now with the testing, it's just that was actually happening a lot more. It's actually happened a lot more than people realize. But I know the cases that I know about, even from friends and whatnot, is always a big deal to the person and, the family.
Yeah, it's a very big deal. And it's, DNA testing didn't start it. Like you say, of course, this has always happened. It's just kind of accelerated it. And a lot of the people that I've interviewed who have discovered that they're the product of like a non-paternity event have said, I kind of always knew, or I didn't outwardly question it, but I think on a subconscious level, I wondered, or I always felt a little different. There's a lot of people who will say that the discovery of an NPE or something else through DNA explains questions that they long had, or puts memories into context that previously didn't have a context, or puts family dynamics into context that helps them make sense, things they never understood. It all kind of fits together once they have that key piece of information.
Okay. Alice Collins Playbook. Am I pronouncing her name right?
Close. It's Playbook.
Playbook. Okay. So is that an Irish name? Is that? So
Collins is Irish. She's Irish. And then her married name is German. Playbook.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So she found out. I'm not supposed to spoil the story, but anyway, so her story is been out there. It's in the press. But could you talk about kind of talk about that story without getting into too many details?
Sure. Yeah. So the book that I wrote, The Lost Family, it tells a lot of stories. And some of those stories are from people who reached out to me, after my original Washington Post article ran, right? But I wanted to kind of shape this book around a central narrative that would keep you going, right? And it needed to be like compelling and page turning, because I felt like, well, I'm writing a science book, and I know science can sometimes be like a slog for people, certainly for me, sometimes if it gets too technical. I wanted to include enough science that it would make sense, but I wanted ultimately the book to be the kind of book that you couldn't put down. And so I found that narrative in the story of Alice Collins' Playbook. And I made her the central spine of the book. So, you keep returning to her story because it's so kind of amazing. So Alice is somebody who she tested in 2012, which is not obviously that long ago, but it is actually quite a long time ago in terms of the technology of DNA testing. The databases, this is an industry that's been around for 21 years. And in 2012, it still was quite small, meaning that not a lot of Americans or people elsewhere in the world had tested. And that's important because, the accuracy of the results was not quite clear to a lot of people who were testing back then. And there were things about, the ethnicity estimates that you would get that weren't like perfect in the beginning, and they're still not perfect. And I should back up and say that when you take a DNA test, you're getting two key pieces of information. You're getting an ethnicity estimate, which again is an estimate, it's not perfect, and it's trying to tell you where the various branches of your family tree came from, your ancestors, say 500 to 1,000 years ago. But it's an interpretation, and it's going to change and evolve, right? And the other key piece of information is a list of DNA relatives. So these are people who have tested with the same company, and that company can tell they're related to you because they can see that you and they have overlapping genetic segments. And that is really robust. You can trust it. They don't always say exactly what the nature of the relationship is because they can't necessarily tell, oh, this is your aunt, but they can say like, this is the level of relatedness. This is how much DNA you share. And then it's sometimes up to you to figure out the nature of the relationship. So Alice was testing back in 2012, not knowing the reliability of, in particular, the ethnicity estimates at that time. But she was a genealogist. She believed that she was, almost entirely Irish American. And she takes this test and she gets these results that don't make sense because they seem to suggest that she is half Ashkenazi Jewish, which is Jews from Central and Eastern Europe. And that's completely different, genetic signature from someone who has ancestors from Ireland. So she's half Irish and British, what she expects, half Ashkenazi Jewish. And, thinking, maybe this test isn't ready for prime time, she figures maybe they just messed up. But she's got a very scientific mind, so she doesn't want to abandon it right there. She takes the test again at another company. The second company confirms the first results. Okay. And she embarks on basically it's an existential mystery, right? It's the mystery is who am I? Right. And it takes her 2.5 years to figure it out. But what's fascinating about Alice, in addition to the fact that she's like this dogged, methodical woman with this very scientific, analytical mind, and she keeps at it, she makes this her full-time job, and she does this day after day for 2.5 years, and her techniques are kind of amazing. What's fascinating about it is that her explanation for her unexpected results is not the typical explanation. So usually in this situation, if you take a test and you're expecting that you're going to be, entirely of Greek descent, and lo and behold, you're half German, right? Right. Typically the explanation would be something like a non-paternity event, right? Maybe there was a relationship outside your parents' marriage. Maybe you were donor conceived and you weren't told, or maybe you were adopted and you're not genetically related to either parent. And so she investigates all those, but she's able to eliminate all those possibilities. The last theory that she investigates is the possibility that she descends from a group of people who have hidden their genetic ancestry. Oh. So, historically, there have been Jews, for instance, who have been forced to convert to Catholicism and to kind of hide their religion. There have been, light-skinned African Americans more recently in this country and going back far who, chose to make that difficult decision, right, to escape rampant discrimination. And you have people now who are testing and discovering that is the legacy of their families. And I have a story like that in the book of a man who discovers that he is not Sicilian. He, has significant sub-Saharan African ancestry, and his mom hid it from him to protect him. So Alice investigates that as an explanation of her situation, right? The possibility that her Jewish forebears hid their Jewishness, and that is not the explanation. And the true explanation for her for her unexpected results. And the kind of thread that carries you through the book turns out to go back 100 years. And so I got to do a lot of historical research, which was really, really fun to understand like the context for her surprise and the context for how her family got their story so wrong. But the beauty of using Alice as the vehicle for telling the story of the lost family is that her story is number one, compelling, but also it allows me to tell other stories. So, whenever I explore the possibility that she's a non-paternity event, I tell the story of other people that I've interviewed and their stories of discovering that they are the products of non-paternity events, or that they were adopted and not told, or that they were donor conceived and not told, and what that looks like as a feature of the American condition right now, right? It's really changing our culture, changing our families, changing how we talk to each other, changing people's sense of identity. It's just a really big deal that's happening to us as a nation right now.
Right. Wow. So yeah, I think this is a really relevant topic right now. A lot of research is going on right now that I can see just in the libraries. Isabel Wilkerson's book came out, Cast, and there's a lot of books like that, and there's a lot of anti-racist books, and everybody looking into the system that's of a racial organization that so many people have mentally, and DNA testing, while like the heritage aspect, like that you talked about, are kind of it's not perfect, like you say, but it's interesting, that people can go back and get ideas of what groups that they may be a part of, when before it was so much based on appearance, and you really couldn't scientifically say, who was what, and it really, and the whole concept is questionable, to say the least. But I think this is going to be really interesting. So I hope a lot of people, get out there and check it out, The Lost Family.
Yeah, one of the things that, that DNA testing makes very evident is how similar we are to one another, right? And DNA testing and the study of the genetics of populations in general really throws cold water on a lot of the pseudoscientific ideas about race and genetic difference that we have held onto. So that's something that I think is really important to think about. We're 99.5 genetically identical to every other human being. And I explore a lot in the book, what ethnicity testing can tell you and what it can't, and why you need to be kind of careful in your assumptions, because with the way that it's presented and sometimes with the advertising, it's very easy to veer into like ideas of like racial essentialism, right? And that is something that I think as we engage with it more and more, we have to be super aware of, that we're not going in that direction, because that is not the lesson that we need to be taking away from this kind of testing. I think the other thing is that if you can use DNA testing and genealogy, if you can use this moment in the right way, then it means that we are learning about our present by understanding the past, right? And that means exploring the inequities and the cruelties of the past. It means understanding sort of how we got to this moment, and informing, really informing ourselves about about how we have certain assumptions, right, about difference, and I sort of look at that too. The history of the early field of genetics is very inextricably tied to beliefs about eugenics, which are now debunked, right? So that's you have to kind of acknowledge that in order to like be clear-eyed about the moment that we're in.
That's true. Okay. What about the psychological transformation? Whether with Alice Collins or anybody, what kind of things does it really do to a person to find out, who they're related to?
Right, and who they are not, right? and how their assumptions have been mistaken all that time. It's a big deal. I've interviewed and emailed, corresponded with like literally hundreds of people who've taken a DNA test and wanted to say like, here's how it changed me. And if you discover something profound about your genetic origins that you didn't know, it is often people often describe it like as a trauma, and that they have to kind of then rethink their lives, right? And understanding that your beginnings are different, it puts the whole rest of your personal narrative into a different context, right? It makes you tell your story differently. It alters your relationship with your parents. Sometimes it can be a breach of trust that people have a hard time forgiving.
Oh, yeah.
You didn't tell me. How could you
Right.
not tell me? You know, I'm 45 years old. How did you not tell me? And then often there's a desire to reach out and like get to know, if either through research or through contact, to get to know like the person on the other side, right? Like my long lost sister, right? And the context for how we are related, that whole thing, like people, they become obsessive about it. I mean, in general, we're in this genealogical moment where a lot of us are obsessive about genealogy right now. And genealogy is this great kind of personal detective story that you can launch yourself on. And one of the things that I was really excited to explore in The Lost Family was like this, you know, why we're in a genealogical moment right now. Like, why are we looking to the past to define ourselves so much? And, you know, the like pure pleasures and joys of going down that rabbit hole, which I did a little myself when I was writing the book, you know, like you can just start going back and back and back in the records. And it's like one thing leads to another and you're following these breadcrumbs and it's like completely amazing.
Right.
So, you know, there's a kind of a gift of genealogy in this moment, right? And then for the people who are surprised by their results, that can be really difficult, but it can also be a gift as well. And people have told me that even though they were, you know, not expecting to get this news and it was difficult to contend with, they were glad to know because now they knew the truth about their own identities.
Right.
And that is like a really meaningful thing to have. That knowledge is just deeply meaningful to people, the truth.
Yes, exactly. I think I completely agree. Home DNA testing impacts adoptees, you know, more than anybody else. I'd imagine, you know, other than certain other cases that are probably a little more rare. But for somebody who was adopted and didn't know it, could you talk about that a little bit? How that impacts them?
Yeah, so there's a whole history of closed adoption records in this country. Many states restrict adoptees from accessing their original birth certificates, which means they don't have information about their birth parents, which means they don't have important medical information. They don't have clues to their parents' identity and means of connecting with them before they pass away. They don't have basically information that is incredibly fundamental to their own identity. And there have been many cases where people who are adopted have been able to find their birth parents and reconnect with them. And there's a sense of incredible urgency about wanting to do that before, you know, your birth parents or any siblings you might have are gone.
Right.
And so adoptees were a pioneering group in terms of using DNA testing to find their way to genetic relatives. And they did this starting about 10 years ago using these consumer DNA databases. They figured out that by using some kind of techniques known as genetic genealogy, that they could find somebody who wasn't in the database. And that is kind of the key insight that, you know, that's important to think about because we share genetic segments. My decision to take a DNA test impacts somebody who's related to me but has never tested because they are potentially identifiable to someone who's related to them and looking for them because I tested. And that could be because I'm the sister of the person who's sought, or it could be because I'm the third cousin of the person who's sought. So the decision of a stranger who's genetically related to you, but you've never met because they're a third cousin and you don't know all your third cousins, right? Their decision to test has impacts on you. So in many ways, there's increasingly no opting out of this technology. And that can be, that can be a tremendous gift in terms of finding people. And it can also lead, depending on the situation, to this conflict between, you know, one person's desire to know and other person's right to privacy, right? So there's all these different ways that it plays out. But adoptees in particular, you know, figured out how to pioneer these techniques to where they could find, like, for instance, an adopted woman could find her birth mother, even if her birth mother wasn't in the system, by piecing together information from third and fourth cousins she found in the DNA databases. And another group that's been very much affected by this is donor conceived people. people who
Yeah.
are conceived by sperm donor, and want to know the identities of their donor fathers or their siblings. And that has led to some really interesting revelations, because it turns out that in the United States, there's no limits on the number of children that one donor father can conceive. Which means that if a man is a donor for years and years, maybe in a small community, the donor children may be meeting each other, maybe becoming friends and roommates and classmates and all this stuff without even knowing that they're related. And there's always this potential anxiety around the possibility of dating, right? Yeah. There are now, in large part because of DNA testing, we now know that there are these sprawling genetic networks of more than 100 half-siblings who are finding each other, sometimes as many as between 100 and 200. So that really opens up all these questions about, how do you manage that? Like, do you have relationships with all those people, or do you consider them all siblings? It kind of throws this fascinating light on questions about family, right? How do you define family? How do you think of the donor who donated half your genetic material, or we call them donors, but technically he was paid for it, right? And so there's all these kind of fascinating questions that come from the kind of intersection of one technology with another, right? The technology of fertility labs and donor insemination kind of colliding with the technology of DNA testing.
Right. That can be really a lot of issues come from that. I mean, when you mentioned it, I thought about it before. Oh, certain, finding siblings that you don't know about, and how awkward it can be if one parent has so many siblings, so many children spread out all over, over a period of time. But thinking of it in the context of sperm donors, that can get really tough.
Yeah. I mean, I write in the book about one man who donated in the 70s. So his name's Robert, and he donated in the 70s. He was like newly married. He had a baby girl, and his wife was like, listen, we're having trouble making ends meet. How about this? And so he started doing sperm donations, like $25 for every donation. And it helped him, kind of make ends meet. And he felt like he was helping other people create their families. He never anticipated the DNA age, right? Yeah. So the last time I talked to him, he had learned that he had helped conceive at least 23 children.
Wow.
In addition to the 2 daughters that he had, with his wife and raised. So now what, right? Like the whole dance, like you were saying, it's like this, there's a delicate dance of, for all these people, right? The awkwardness is the word you used, right? The awkwardness of it. There's a delicate dance for him. How does he interact with these children who are they, they're raised within the context of other families, and they mostly have other dads, right? So he's not their dad.
Right.
Even the terminology of what to call one another is challenging, right? What do they call him? What do they call one another? It's just this fascinating kind of frontier that we're just starting to figure out.
Right. Well, I really hope we get into it, educating ourselves about this type of thing, because everybody has to take these ideas and issues into account before they act. So I hope everybody is cognizant that DNA testing will bring everything to light, or could bring a lot of things that you would rather keep private, and all these issues that are potentially there for the children or whatever is going on. Have you taken a home DNA test?
Yeah, I have. I've taken 3 of them. And you might say, like, why would you take 3, right? Your DNA is not going to change. But you can test it more than one company. You can get different information. So you might have DNA relatives at one company that aren't at another. And connecting with those DNA relatives is really helpful, right? You can compare trees. We found in one database a cousin who lived in Sweden, which is where my great-grandmother came and emigrated from. And she's in Sweden, so she's connected to us from before that process of my great-grandmother leaving. And so she had all this tons of information that we would never have had access to if we hadn't found her in that one particular database. The other reason that you might want to test in more than one place is that you may be interested in how the different ethnicity estimates kind of shape up, right? And some of them are more kind of reliable than others, right?
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I've tested, and for me, like, it helped a great deal with genealogical understanding and research. Like, I've become more and more convinced that the ways that the past can shape us, right? Even if we don't know it, we are kind of the products of the decisions of people we never met. Sometimes through accidents of fate and whims and things that, maybe you and I don't think twice about, we are shaping the lives of our great great grandchildren, which is a little too much to think about it and make you crazy if you go down that path. But it is certainly the case, right? And so, when I've been researching my forebears, my ancestors, through the information I can get through DNA and genealogy, I'm kind of like continually kind of awed by the gift of this knowledge of how I came to be, even if it's accidental, right? And by the different forces that shape their lives, and how, on the one hand, separate I feel from them, right? Like I'm living in a completely different age, and also the continuity, like how much likeness there is. So, I've written about this before for some columns that I write, but a lot of people turned to genealogy during this pandemic because they wanted to know, how this, for instance, the Spanish flu affected the lives of their great grandparents, right? Or their grandparents, because they wanted to know how they were going to get through this pandemic. Right. And there's something about, history can be a little abstract. It's like far away. Who are those people? But if you see history in the lives of your ancestor, then you can get lessons from it. You can get wisdom from it. You can get a sense of continuity and perseverance. Like, oh, they made it through. I can make it through too.
Okay, I understand that.
Yeah.
That's great. I'm hesitant to take the test. I'm not that interested. I know a lot of my family. I know a big part of my family on my mom's side, and my dad's side. I know a lot of them too, and we all get along, and it's fine. But if I find anybody else, I'd rather just find it through the context of living and stories and oral history. I'm not really going. I don't think I'm going to take one, but but I can understand the draw. And I just think it's great. I think it's really interesting. And I want to thank you so much for talking to us today. Is there anything else you want to talk about that we didn't touch on?
No, thank you so much for having me. This has been such a delight. And I'm just thrilled to be able to join you for this fascinating conversation. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much on behalf of the Jackson Hinds Library System, the Medgar Evers Library. We thank Libby Copeland, and we hope you all get a chance to check it out. The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are. A fascinating read. Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.